Welcome to We Are Human Leaders, and when you're here with us, you're part of this incredible movement driving change. Because each conversation is an invitation to grow, to question, and to co-create a future where people, business, and society flourish together. And today's conversation is certainly one of those you won't want to miss. We, Sally, myself, and Alexis, are here to guide you on this journey, to connect you with really big ideas, bold conversations. We're going to push some boundaries, ask the brave questions that help you live and lead in a more human way every single day. Lex, this was quite a romp of a conversation. What did you take today?
Where do I even start? This conversation on authenticity went deep. It went wide. I love that Thomas really unpacked for us some key characters in society right now and helped us really understand what authenticity does or doesn't look like in action. So for me, it was really shifting the narrative around what authenticity meant, the sort of implicit understanding that I had of that. And it's given me a new sort of framework, if you will, or angle of how to sort of align my behavior, my thinking to really have impact in the world in the way that I would like to. What did you take out of it, Sel?
Yeah, look, it just a very similar sort of really sort of unpicking a lot of the ideas that I think I have about authenticity. He really hit the nail on the head in terms of, I think, looking at our society and where we're at in terms of our potentially excessive focus on self and self-development. And we're missing that such an important piece of connecting it through to others. His research is just incredible. And of course, today we're talking to Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who's a professor of business psychology at University College London and Columbia University. He's also an associate at Harvard's Entrepreneurial Finance Lab. We are unpacking his 12th book, Don't Be Yourself: Why Authenticity is Overrated and What to Do Instead. It's such a rich conversation. Let's delve in. Welcome to We Are Human Leaders, Thomas. It's a delight to have you with us today. We're so excited for this conversation. Authenticity is a big word for both of us and for all of our listeners. It's also something that we've heard sort of reverberating around the leadership space for many years now. And the advice to just be yourself, it's ubiquitous, but it's also quite confusing. We'd love to hear your take on this. Why is telling someone, hey, just be yourself, actually not the most helpful of advice?
Well, first, thank you for the invitation to have this conversation with you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And let's start with, maybe the most obvious yet often overlooked point regarding the logical flaws underpinning the notion of authenticity, which is like, how could you possibly not be yourself? I mean, even if you try to be somebody else, everything you do is part of who you are, all your behaviors, your thoughts, whatever. So, it's not very helpful to have a prompt or a behavioral hack or nudge, if you like, that cannot be followed, but it can also not be disobeyed, right, to begin with. Then I think there is the notion that, if there is one thing that behavioral science has consistently shown us and replicated over the past 4 to 5 decades, is that it is actually very, very hard to understand who you truly are deep down. So if we measure whether somebody is being authentic or the degree to which somebody is being authentic according to their own parameters or benchmark, well, all we know is that people differ in their tendency and ability to bullshit themselves, but we all do. We all do. I mean, if our definition of who we truly are deep down is the hero in our own mind or the version of ourselves that we think is genuine, well, that's not really going to cut it. And if you want to measure whether you're being authentic by some external parameters, I'm trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst, and I learned very early in my life that good luck if you want to go into therapy for 10 or 15 years. I mean, your best outcome there is to find out that you're neurotic. If not, you're psychotic. If you're neurotic, you learn to understand that there is no such thing such as the real you, and you have to learn to embrace the uncertainty and ambivalence that actually underpins your character. And if you're psychotic, then, well, you might be truly convinced that you are Napoleon or Elon Musk or Napon Elon, as the historian Niall Ferguson calls him. but that's not necessarily a single source of true or an objective source of your identity. So I think fundamentally HR professionals should try to not open this kind of worm, and if they do, then it's some tangible, concrete, and workable definitions of what we mean when we say that people should be authentic. And really what we actually mean is that they should be trustworthy, and they should not come across as a fraud, and they should elicit a certain degree of genuineness while also being effective and pro-social. And people who do this, they spend a lot of time working on the reputation. They're definitely not their unfiltered, uncensored, or uninhibited self.
Thomas, a question slightly nerdy on the research side of this here. It sounds to me a little bit like your explanation of this draws on some of Erving Goffman's work around the presentation of self as well. How does that kind of interact with this idea of authentic, being that we're always in some way or another being performative to an extent?
Yeah, and if our listeners haven't read the marvelous work by Erving Goffman, the father of sociology, who wrote many books on the presentation of self in everyday life, and he essentially coined this idea of behavior as always existing in a theater, in a sort of performative instance. In fact, even when nobody's watching you, you're still dependent and influenced by other people. So again, if we take one of the most universal and commonly accepted mantras underlying the definition of authenticity, or the concept of authenticity, which is that you shouldn't worry about what people think of you, or you should just ignore what other people tell you. Well, it is impossible to do so, right? I mean, well, let alone if you want to disobey that statement, you're already influenced by that statement. So it's like you cannot follow it or disobey it. But fundamentally, all of our values, our beliefs, our ideas are inculcated to us or transmitted to us by early socialization. So whether it's parenting or significant others, schools, etc. You do have these freakishly unusual and anomalous examples of like feral children. In the book, I talk about, I don't know if you've seen The Wolf Pack, but it's a great example of that, right? Modern examples. So 7 or 8 siblings that grow up in a council flat or social housing estate in the East Village, and they're not allowed to leave. So they never actually set foot in the streets of New York. But still, all of their knowledge about life comes from watching movies. And luckily, their dad, who is crazy, really literally crazy and a psychopath, at least exposes them to nice movies. So, they think the world is a Tarantino film, and they learn to rehearse various scenes of Pulp Fiction. And in a way, it's not so different from what you find outside in the real world. But you cannot be not influenced by other people. So, so I think there are definitely degrees of caring and degrees of awareness as to how our behavior impact others. But all the research shows that the leaders who are most effective, the managers who are most competent, the workers who are better team players and better colleagues, they don't go around the office or Zoom and Teams meeting neglecting or disregarding how they impact other people. Instead, they pay a great deal of attention to how their words and actions impact others. And that doesn't make them insecure. That actually makes them mature human beings.
Amazing, Thomas. And what I'm hearing here is this kind of delineation between what I think authenticity has been characterized as almost this like, just take the foot off the gas pedal, stop trying, just be yourself, don't listen to anything, and really kind of almost a lazy approach to leadership and workplace interactions, to actually what is quite an involved process of self-awareness and self-improvement that actually drives great leadership outcomes. Is that sort of an accurate depiction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's unfortunate that any concept that has some impact and becomes a popular concept, not just in management sciences and HR, but in general in the world, always becomes diluted and distorted and watered down to the point that it misses or it loses its potential benefit. It's the same with authenticity. I think if we understand that What I'm arguing about is a more nuanced approach, and that, just like being pathologically insecure and overly dependent on what other people think of you is bad, and nobody wants to be in that situation. And it's certainly, we have lots of examples, whether it's imposter syndrome or just general social anxiety or insecurity, even like the case of vulnerable or neurotic narcissism. So people with an inflated yet fragile ego who are desperately needy of other people's approval. If you watch, I don't know if there's an Australian version of The Office. There probably is, right? But you can watch
They're making one, actually.
Okay, they're making one, right? So the UK and the US, yeah, the UK and the US ones are very different. They both really depict their respective office cultures really well. But what they have in common is that the main character, Michael Scott in the US version and David Brent in the British one, is an insecure narcissist. So,
Yeah.
they think they're great, but actually they don't fully believe their own BS. So they need approval all the time. Of course, they also have sense of humor. And because they're not your boss, there is a cathartic element to watching that. But, in all of these instances, we see that it's a little bit sad and almost pathetic when people are so reliant on other people's approval and validation that they crave attention. And it's not a very free or fun way to experience life. Having said that, I think that most of the problems that we experience in the world, which are leadership problems, are actually caused by the opposite phenomenon. People who are so entitled and who have so much power, so much status, the privileged elite that actually isn't accountable for anything it does and can truly unleash its unfiltered and uncensored self on others. Again, Elon Musk would be a great example, even if you think he is a genius, and he might be, or that he has noble aspirations and professional career goals that could improve humanity. There is a vision there, and at least, he's trying to go to Mars and, kind of give us robots that might help our productivity, etc. But does he really need to bully and attack people 24/7 online? Does he really need to, kind of project his antisocial and unfiltered thoughts and opinions to others? If you think that's good because that's freedom of speech, there's a great line by Karl Popper that I use in the book, which is that, you cannot have a tolerant society unless you're intolerant to intolerance. So, there cannot be any form of cohesive and pro-social harmonic coexistence between humans unless we all understand where the right to be ourselves ends and our obligation to others begins. And unfortunately, those who are the powerful elite don't give a shit about this. And, so I think in a nutshell, it would be wiser and we would be better off if we spend less time pointing the finger at those who are the out group, those who are diverse and low status individuals, for blaming them for not being themselves, and more time holding those who are in power accountable for being themselves too much or too often.
That might be one of the most important things I've heard in a hot minute, Thomas. So thank you for that. And Elon is a contentious issue that Sally and I won't even go into because we do not have enough time to unpack our thoughts on Elon Musk in this podcast. But what I would like to...
But just to say on him, because I think also it's important to try to understand the good and the bad in people. And somebody basically talking about Elon Musk, I think, presented the most redeeming kind of argument against it, which is that maybe, in the end, he won't be judged by all the bad things he did and does, petty, small, vicious attacks on others, or, dark side schemes to ruin some of the positive aspects of it, but by his achievements, right? And that's possible. Look, there could be a list of maybe 1,000 people who, in the balance, there's not even positive things to say about them. So I think, so I think, at least we have to consider both things, basically. Yes, Scott Galloway was, I think, the one who said this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point, Thomas. And I'd love to point us back now to your book because I think it has so much value for leaders. Specifically, in the book, you talk about 4 authenticity traps. Can you tell us what these are and walk us through them with a little more depth? Maybe if we can start with the always be honest with yourself and others authenticity trap.
Yeah, so that's the first trap. And as you noted, yeah, I mentioned there are basically, people might not have the same definition. There's an academic approach to it. There's a colloquial or popular business sense. But, generally speaking, we all agree that there are these 4 mantras around authenticity. And actually, the point I make is that there are traps because if you truly wanted to follow them, you would actually find yourself either logically conflicted because they're not so easy to follow, or indulging or opting for indulging in or opting for behaviors that actually decrease your effectiveness, your adaptability, and your interpersonal skills. So the first one is always be true to yourself and others. So if we start with that one, well, of course, I think children, even as little as 4 or 5 years old, learn to understand that even though their parents told them always be honest, actually that's not going to work in life, right? They have to learn to master the art of performative white lies and to pretend that they liked the cake when they didn't, and to pretend that they liked their Christmas present when they didn't, or to pretend that they believe in Santa Claus when in fact they didn't, because otherwise they're going to spoil things for everybody else, right? So pro-social lying is really important already when we are children. And of course, there has been in recent years a lot of talk about so-called cultures of radical candor and radical transparency, like Bridgewater and Ray Dalio, and to some degree, a milder version of that is Amazon. These are horrible environments to work in. And even Ray Dalio himself says, well, if somebody just had a child and returned to the office and is showing you a picture of their baby, you're not going to say that's a really ugly baby, right? So there's always like a case for censoring what you really, really think. And that the case generally has to do with empathy being more important and with actually,
Yeah.
persuasively or convincingly making an effort to not hurt other people's feelings. Then there is a more metaphysical and philosophical element of that. Is like, can you truly be honest with others if you're not honest with yourself, right? And this is really, really important to actually flesh out or expand because, as you know, I've researched incompetent leadership for a long time, and the typical kind of archetype of the incompetent man who becomes a leader actually signals the prevalence of self-deception in leadership and in the corporate world, in organizational life, right? If you bullshit yourself about thinking, into thinking that you're amazing when you're not, that you're a great, person, leader, salesman, etc., you don't even have to bullshit other people. You can be honest with others.
Yeah.
Because it's like the best salesman or salesperson doesn't need to lie to their customers because they have lied to themselves about thinking like, this is an amazing product, an amazing tool, etc. So that happens as well. And what's interesting here is there's a lot of nuance because on the one hand, the world would be better off if we all had self-awareness and we all knew our limitations and but actually much of the corporate world is sadly optimized to reward people who have deceived themselves. If you go to a job interview thinking that you're amazing when you're not, you're going to beat the candidates that demonstrate some self-doubt. If you're giving a presentation to a client and you think you're incredible when you're not, and of course that happens more often if you're a man than if you're a woman. But, we should be careful, like preaching honesty when the world actually and society at large is rewarding dishonesty even with ourselves. As I said before, it's not so easy to truly understand who you really are or whether you're being honest. So I think I take an interpersonal framework to assess kind of a genuineness and sincerity and honesty, which is like, it's much more helpful, even though it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But if other people see you as trustworthy, that means you're behaving in such a way that there is sufficient closeness between your words and your actions, and there is sufficient reliability and predictability in your behavior And ultimately, being a great boss is having created a reputation in your team whereby they feel safe. They're not afraid
Yeah.
that tomorrow they don't know who they're going to find. And that actually doesn't come as a consequence of always being honest with them. It comes as a consequence of caring about them and curating a consistent professional self that may or
Yeah.
not resemble the real you.
Mm. Thomas, to my mind, what you've just said also links directly to another trap that you mentioned in the book, which is don't worry about what others think of you. And to sort of rewind for a second here, we have a concept that we speak about at Human Leaders a lot, which we call the intention impact gap. And as you've mentioned, it's kind of this idea, it's the space between how we think we're showing up and the actual impact that others, or we're having on others rather. And so can you tell us a little bit more around this trap around actually caring about what others think and how these maybe interrelate?
Yeah. And so I tell a little story, little anecdote in the book, which is a true story. Somebody, who works for me in my team, by the way, that still not aware of this. So they're going to find out when they read the book that,
When the book comes out.
not identified, but lovely guy, high performing, high potential leader, genuinely curious and interested in improving his leadership, and just a great guy, very, very liked by everybody else, but unfortunately somewhat corrupted or contaminated by mainstream self-help thinking, especially in the US, around leadership. And so one day he came to my office wearing this t-shirt that said, "Just be you, they will adjust." And he was proudly wearing this t-shirt, hoping, to talk about not just, his performance or work, but this.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help myself, I could not be myself. And I said, "Can we talk about your t-shirt for a minute? Because you realize this is like possibly the most narcissistic item of clothing anybody could ever wear. Like if we all do this, we would be living in a world of like a bunch
Chaos.
of self-centered, egomaniac, entitled
Yeah.
narcissists. Like, and if you are the only person able to wear that T-shirt because the world needs to adjust to you, which, by the way, I know isn't true because that's not how he thinks, but it had never occurred to him that there was this strong narcissistic, selfish connotation to this, right? Of course, at the other extreme, sometimes when I talk about this or the research in places like Korea or Japan or even Sweden and Finland, people say, "But we hear you and understand you, but we're already so oppressed." In Sweden, you have sayings such as "the nail that sticks out needs to be hammered back in," and people are always so polite and to some degree conformist, but so sensitive to the cultural etiquette that they would never tell you that they disagree with you. And there is a downside to that, of course, which is passive aggressiveness and conflict avoidance. I always say conflict avoidant people generate a lot of conflict in the long run, right?
Yep.
But I think both extremes are problematic. And what I'm trying to do in a way is kind of dial down the narcissism and the self-centeredness that has, kind of corrupted or contaminated mainstream thinking coming from West Coast US sort of like self-help to all the way to Australia. Of course, I think Australia in some ways has the strength of both British and American cultures. You're capable of not taking yourself too seriously, and you can be self-deprecating, and you understand sarcasm and irony, but you also have a kind of healthy and positive American sense of can-do optimism, right? But sometimes you also have the worst of both worlds, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
not positive enough and not negative enough. But so, this mantra fundamentally says, look, I mean, it will be impossible for you to follow this rule that don't worry about what people think of you unless you're autistic or on the spectrum or a feral child, So in a way, we should disregard it altogether at the outset because you can follow it. But even if you try to follow it, be careful, because we know from 360-degree surveys that the best leaders are those who are aware of the reputation. So they are,
Yeah.
what does it mean to be self-aware? To be self-aware actually means to be other-aware, to know how other people see you. And it's only when you can incorporate other people's views on you into your self-concept that you can actually grow and hope to change them. Even people who were not self-aware in the traditional introspective sense of the word, like Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, they're very good at understanding how they impact others. Now, they don't always care about that, or they don't always care about changing their behaviors in the direction that some people might want, but they're masters at understanding. Even if you think about that scene, right, where he's shot last year and his first reaction is to stand up and the fist goes up and say, fight, fight, fight. I mean, who on earth would think of doing that in that situation? And again, it's that you don't have to like him to appreciate that he's constantly on stage. He's constantly on stage. So actually, the point that I make is that people, the leaders who seem authentic to us, and I'm talking about not the ones that we like from an ideological standpoint, but the ones that actually are outside our values and our ideological kind of echo chamber or cosmos or realm, we see them as authentic because they behave like method actors. They're constantly in character to the point, and I think in that sense, Trump is not very different from Obama. I'm sure both are very different from their public personas when they get home. We have to ask maybe Michelle and Melania to tell us that. But at the same time, I'm sure they're very difficult. It's very hard to catch them off guard because they're performing all the time. So if you think about that, that's like the opposite of saying, "Oh, don't worry about what people think of you." They may have stopped worrying because it's so natural to them that they became their professional self.
Right.
And I think sometimes we equate this with being a politician. There is often a thin line between very acute or sophisticated political skills and being a politician, which has a bad reputation. But actually, you are going to be more successful in your career as a leader and as an organizational citizen or employee if you're closer to that than if you just say anything that crosses your mind to anybody and you don't give a shit about what people think of you, for sure, right? I would say, if Elon Musk is your role model, or Steve Jobs, or Donald Trump, or whoever that is, well, good luck going through the first stage of your interviews if you're hoping to be employed by somebody. There's a reason why a lot of these people had to work for themselves and weren't able to sustain a job when they had a boss.
So many interesting and valuable points there, Thomas. And I think, you frequently refer in the book to the importance of emotional intelligence, almost as a counterpoint to, I think, this narrative of authenticity. And I wonder if in some ways, but I think, historically there was probably a time where people really did feel like they'd lived their lives according to other people's values, and they'd kind of, we've almost potentially swung that pendulum so far back in the opposite direction of now I have to be so attuned to myself and so incredibly authentic as a counterpoint to having, perhaps made decisions that didn't feel authentic to me. And I wonder if there's a healthy way that we can find through improving our emotional intelligence to not living a life according to someone else's values and not being so, deeply narcissistic that we're actually in a sort of a destructive space. How can we use EQ, hone into a really human-centered and great leadership style in our organizations?
Yeah. And, I need to first react to the first part of your question, which is, where does this come from, right? And I think it's like the age of the self, or if you like, Adam Curtis, the great British documentary maker, has a documentary called The Century of the Self, which talks about where this all starts. It starts with like from a very good place, which is, there is this thing called progress in society, and the world becomes richer, and we evolve with first the Enlightenment, and then the Industrial Revolution, and quality of life goes up, etc. But what happens with the rise of humanism is, in essence, we replace God as a source of meaning with ourselves as a source of meaning, right? So, I mean, when Nietzsche said God is dead, I mean, he was alluding to something that had happened 200 or 300 years before his period, but he kind of put the nail in the coffin and alluded to that. Like, basically, if we think that all progress depends on us and that science is the most reliable and trustworthy method for getting to know the world and getting, closer, or, getting to truth in itself, all the meaning depends on ourselves. So we can also, it's very fragile because we can also take it away, it can disappear very quickly. So with that comes like, a lot of external sources of meaning, whether it's religion, even philosophy, metaphysics, community, etc., are replaced by this individualistic approach to meaning. And the German Korean philosopher Han has a really, really good book and expression for that, which is basically, we go from repression in the Middle Ages and in the pre-humanist kind of world, pre-enlightenment world, because we lived sort of like under the tyranny of serfdom and like the elites and aristocracy, and most people were oppressed and slaves, etc., to actually the tyranny of the self, or the tyranny of me, which is like, if you're responsible for everything, for your meaning, your career success, your happiness, etc., you go from repression to depression very quickly, because you can only blame yourself when things don't work well, right? Even in the context in which sort of like the authenticity cult emerges, which is the American dream, and you can be anything you want if you really try to, well, we know if that is the case, then surely at least half of the population needs to be clinically depressed, because they apparently they can't be what they wanted. So is it because they don't want it enough, or is it because they're losers? And this narrative is quite punitive. So if we bring that to the realities of today, I think the kind of the notion that we are basically at mercy from our own kind of maybe aspirational or ideal self, I think ends up being trapped in this same sort of mental schema, which is success is always dependent on our own talents and merit. If I do well in life, it's because I'm a genius. And let's quite frankly, everybody can see that too many people get too far in life because of privilege or luck, or where they start in the lottery of life. But then you also punish yourself extremely when it doesn't work out. So I think again, it's healthier to put fewer eggs in that one basket, which is the basket of our self concept or our identity, and at least understand that the best way to kind of develop a healthy sense of who we are is to have others participate in that development and evolution, and to actually get input or let our identity be curated by others. And and I think that can be achieved, but you can see how we've gone down this dark side of like, I was speaking to a CEO recently about the book, and it's like, it's like even parenting, if you see the American parenting model, which is basically I sum it up, or can be boiled down to go girl, like, girl, you can be like, go girl. It's like, it's a nice thought, but why don't we spend more time actually tackling the barriers, the obstacles, the biases, fairness that exists, as opposed to brainwashing people into, thinking that, the world is fair and there are no issues. By the way, if you have a whole society or system optimized for this delusion and for self-belief rather than self-awareness, in the end, there are some benefits to society, because if a million people think they can be the next Elon Musk, it's more likely that one emerges. But what happens to the 999 that don't? Do we care about them, or we just leave them behind because, well, they didn't want to do it? They didn't ascribe, they didn't truly believe in themselves. They didn't go girl.
What's interesting about your point there as well, Thomas, is it sounds like we sort of have collectively shifted the mindset away from being of service to others to implicitly making people believe that the pursuit of success and status and grandiose impact in the world should be everyone's life goal. And I've sort of long been a believer that this really rugged individualism will be a big part of the collapse of Western societies, in my humble opinion.
I mean, you're going into kind of deep territory now, but I think let's at least as a thought experiment, right? It's not so difficult to entertain the idea, that obviously there are different values and there are different cultures. Even if you look at national or regional cultures, there are obviously the institutions that have been put in place that reflected the values of leaders over time. And I think there's always a competition between values. And even though it's like, extreme and unhealthy oversimplification to talk about East versus West, there is still this notion that you have more collectivistic cultures and more individualistic cultures. Now, globalization to a large extent is about importing Western American cultures and values onto the East. I would say, like, you can talk now about the rise of China and the competition between the US and China, but maybe, the cultural bomb that American society can launch on China and the East in the form of kind of soft power or kind of a, Hollywood style propaganda can actually make Eastern cultures more like American cultures. So if you export enough Kim and Kanye's to the East, and, Instagram and digital narcissism are the default or de facto culture for young people everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter. And then, of course, you have TikTok, which is the perfect version of that. But if that is the culture and is a culture of me, and it's a culture that anywhere in the world has persuaded people that engaging in inappropriate self-disclosure and sharing what your cat had for breakfast every morning and telling everybody that you got upgraded to business class is the way to live your life. I think it does make you miss some of the more pro-social collectivistic features of some of these other cultures, right? And so I think, in the whole, of course, if you have a group where intra-group competition is so high that inter-group competition becomes impossible. And if you have societies, organizations, or groups where the most narcissistic individual is put in charge of coordinating human activity, those groups are not going to be led very effectively. The institutions in those societies are not going to function very well. They're going to be corrupted. It's difficult for people to understand these issues because you have to project or simulate things even as a thought experiment 50, 100 or 200 years into the future, right? We could talk about, why is Australia more successful than Argentina? Compare them. They're both far away. They're both young countries, etc. It's like, well, the simple answer is because of the power of institutions that function well in Australia and are by and large very corrupt in Argentina.
It's so interesting, Thomas. And I think this is kind of this macro scale. We could spend hours, if not days, unpacking this with you because we both have so many thoughts around it. To kind of shift the lens a little bit, I just wanted to sort of test with you one of the definitions that I've used personally of authenticity, because it is actually I identified as one of my core values, controversially perhaps in this conversation. But the way that I characterize that is really sort of, for me, unpacking and removing layers of self-delusion. And that's, for me, the pursuit of authenticity for me. And that obviously is partly through self-reflection, but a lot of, seeking feedback from outside me as well. In your opinion, am I mischaracterizing authenticity? Is there a better word I could be using for that process?
Yeah. So, I think that is first a very kind of a worthwhile quest. And I think I would just call it self-knowledge. And I think, it's healthy to remove the layers. And I think you never get, it's like an onion, right? You peel it and you never get to, it's always another layer.
So many layers, Thomas.
But I think that we need to be realistic about what benefits that brings to others, because it can result in like you being a better person. It can result in, like, to some degree now, the whole sort of like mindfulness quest and meditation and the intra-psychical elements of self-discovery and identity, I think they can also become a very selfish and self-centered exercise. And I'm not saying that's the case for you, right? But I think looking outside is more important than looking inside. And in the book, I talk about, it's like one way to be true to yourself or discover who you really are. I mentioned Freudian psychoanalysis or Lacanian psychotherapy first, but, you could also check into an ashram in India, as the Beatles did, and, that helped them experiment with drugs. Now a lot of bourgeois and middle-class trustafarians in the UK and the US are taking ayahuasca retreats in Costa Rica, and in some instances it leads to self-discovery, and in others they just vomit and get on with life, right? So that's okay. But I
And
think
like, agreed. And I
As
think
someone
it's
who lives
something
in Byron Bay right now, Thomas, I totally
there you
resonate
go.
with
So
that. We
you're
are
Yeah.
exactly.
full
There are
of
these pockets.
self-discovery trustafarians. Well, it's an interesting thing as well, because I think conceptually what gets missed with that is there's an element of self-knowledge, as you've kind of, used that terminology, that is really, really necessary, I think, to connecting to what's important to us, our values and those sorts of things. But we have to then integrate into
Yes.
community and society. And that is the other half of the equation. How do we close the gap between the person I believe myself to be and how other people receive that? And we must get that feedback and meet our communities with a level of pro-social behavior and a willingness to contribute. I mean, I'm probably giving away a lot here around, sort of how I feel about the world right now, but we cannot form our self-concept in solitude. It's simply not possible.
Yeah. And I think, maybe vomiting and getting on with life isn't the worst case scenario. Now and then there is a purge, like how you feel about the world. But yeah, I mean, to go back
Yeah.
to EQ, it's important to see both sides of it, because one is like the intrapersonal and the other is the interpersonal. And I
Yep.
think all of the research on EQ, emotional intelligence, shows that the intrapersonal one, I mean, some people start with a very strong advantage there, and they start with very, very strong tailwinds. For some people, being cool-headed, being calm, being non-reactive, and being like sort of like very phlegmatic is just their natural disposition, and actually they don't need to engage in all of these things. For others, a permanent state of sort of like internal angst and neuroticism and insecurity is the norm. So for sure, if you're in the latter category, you will benefit from anything that is spiritually soothing, etc. But actually, regardless of whether you're the first or the second, regardless you're like calm like the Dalai Lama or the Queen of England, or neurotic like Woody Allen or Tony Soprano, you can actually improve how you deal with others, and you can treat other people better. And that doesn't require, finding yourself or understanding who you truly are deep down. So I think it's the interpersonal dimension of EQ that I'm promoting. And that's where I highlight this sort of like interesting and unexpected clash between deeply caring for others and behaving as the situation demands. And there are big differences there. There's a neuroscientist and social psychologist at Yale University called Paul Bloom, who's written this great book called Against Empathy. And he talks about Against Empathy, which seems like very controversial and clickbaity, but the subtitle is The Case for Rational Compassion. Because it's easy to be nice to the people that you empathize towards, your spouse, your mom, your kids, an elderly lady who is trying to cross the roads, by the way, especially if she's part of your tribe and your culture. But if we actually rely or depend on empathy to be nice, we're not going to create a very pro-social society. So Paul Bloom says, like, actually, even if you don't like the person that you're working with, you have to make an effort to be fake, but treat them well. And I love that notion, right? Which is also why in the third mantra, which is about be true to your values no matter what, which is the other kind of authenticity trap, like follow your heart and values no matter what. The world is full of examples of people who had a really toxic, devastating, destructive impact on the world, and they were actually following their crooked, corrupt, or psychotic values. We want less of that. But even if your values are noble or you think they are the best, it's very egocentric to not be open to other people's values. I enjoy much more talking to people who think differently from me. It's often uncomfortable and painful, but I can end up learning something and expanding my horizons. Look, I mean, even organizations who see themselves as the beacon of liberal progressive values are a cult because they repel or reject people who don't think like them.
I think this is such a powerful point for us to really draw this conversation to a conclusion, Thomas. Again, we could go on for days and weeks to sort of really go deeper into so many of the notions that you've raised with us. But I think what you've given us is a really beautiful call to action for all of us as leaders to, if we are perhaps falling into that trap of this kind of navel gazing, self-reflection, almost indulgent sort of behavior. And, I think all of us have been there at some point or other, but to start to lift our gaze, to open our minds and hearts to the horizon, really start to engage in the world around us so that we become better leaders, better humans, and leave a better legacy. Thank you so much for being with us today. Any final thoughts?
Maybe I will leave you with one final thought, which is, I think, probably my favorite definition or kind of an angle of authenticity, which is from my very good friend Erminia Ibarra, who is a professor at London Business School. And her point is, like, she asks this question, which I think is provocative but also very, very deep and daunting. Why should we limit ourselves to our past and present self if we can also sculpt or create a future self that is different? So by definition, if who you are encompasses not just everything you did in the past and everything you do, especially naturally or spontaneously today, but all the possible selves that you could project into the future, you need to stop playing to your strengths or go outside your nature and personality to venture into the unknown. And I think if we go back to leadership, that's how the greatest and best leaders develop and evolve, by not becoming an exaggerated version of who they already are, but actually going against their nature and sculpting or, creating, translating that potential for being something else into reality.
Brilliant, inspiring, and so beautifully put. Thank you so much for being with us here today on We Are Human Leaders, Thomas.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today at We Are Human Leaders with Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic.
If you would like to learn more about Thomas and get your hands on his juicy new book, find out all the details in our show notes at www.wearehumanleaders.com. Now, as human leaders, we're seeking to lead better, live truer, and be the change that we want to see in the world. This is how we recreate workplaces and a world where people flourish and thrive. We're human first, leader second. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you in the next conversation.